Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. In my last review video, I shared my thoughts on the final book in C.S. Lewis's Narnia series, and today I'm going to give my thoughts on the final book in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, That Hideous Strength. So I've done videos in recent weeks on the first book in that series, Out of the Silent Planet, as well as the second book, Perelandra. And so today I'm excited to give my thoughts on this final book in that set of three books, the Space Trilogy or the Ransom Trilogy, as it's often called. This book, That Hideous Strength, is one that a lot of even people who love C.S. Lewis struggle with or struggle to love. It's a book that has its own kind of critics and controversies, and it's a book that when I was, first reading through the Space Trilogy years ago, in my teen years, I remember really enjoying Out of the Silent Planet. I remember struggling a little bit, but liking Perelandra. And then I tried reading That Hideous Strength, and I didn't get through it the first, I think, 2 times that I tried reading it. It took me 3 goes to make it through the first time. But once I did, I found myself appreciating the book. And it was one of those books that I kind of had to struggle through, but once I had finished it, and I was able to think about it more, and I was able to hear more people kind of reference it and tease out what Lewis was doing, I was able to kind of grow in my appreciation of it. So this most recent reread was for me a really good experience, because I feel like I finally had a sense of what I was going to be encountering and of how to process that. So this was by far my most enjoyable time reading through this book, and I'm excited to share some thoughts with you about it. So this is the third book in the Space Trilogy, written by C.S. Lewis. This volume was published in 1945, so just to remind you, the Space Trilogy actually predates the Narnia books in terms of when Lewis was actually writing them. They kind of came out beginning in the late 30s, and then this one was in 1945. As you can tell from me holding up the volumes, That Hideous Strength stands out as by far the longest of the 3 books. It is also by far the most complex of the 3 books from a literary perspective, from a philosophical perspective, and it's also just kind of a difficult book to read. I mean, Lewis is such a good writer, and you get that on full display here. The characters are very well fleshed out. The ideas and language are interesting and stretching, but it's of the more professorial kind of side of his popular works. So it has its own challenges. So let me kind of walk through a little bit of what some of those things are, and I'm just again giving the heads up here that I'm just going to be talking about the plot of the book. So if you don't want any spoilers, don't watch this. Something else I'll mention right now as well is after reading this, I listened to a great video that Gavin Ortlund did. He has a kind of YouTube apologetics ministry, and he did a video on That Hideous Strength because it's one of his favorite books by Lewis, and he listened to it many times. And he has a great 50-minute video fleshing out what the book is about. So I'll try to post a link if I can remember to that. It'd be a great thing to listen to either if you have read the book but you want to kind of dig into it deeper, or if you don't mind some spoilers, it'd be a great resource to listen to before you read the book if you're feeling intimidated by it. Because some people do find themselves very intimidated by this book. I was definitely in that camp when I first picked it up. Part of the challenge is that when you read the first 2 books in the series, they feel like books that are connected together, and they're all focused on the character of Dr. Ransom. When you pick up this book, we don't know any of the characters. It focuses on this young couple, Mark and Jane Studdick, who are living in this town in England, this kind of university town, that and we don't meet any characters that we've heard about from the other books until a good ways into the story. And the story itself unfolds very slowly. It's not an action-packed book. In fact, part of why if I had not read the book, or my advice to people who've not read the book is, don't be too worried about plot spoilers, because the plot's not the main attraction here. It's the characters that Lewis is giving us, the ideas that he's working with, is where the real enjoyment and payout comes from. So you can have a sense of what's going to happen in terms of plot, and yet still very much enjoy the book. And in fact, knowing a little bit about what Lewis is doing will help you to enjoy the book more, I would suggest. But Lewis is unpacking the story of this young couple. Neither of them are believers. They're newly married. Both of them are academics, but they represent kind of natural pairs or opposites. And again, here, I just want to give a nod to Gavin Ortland's video, because he did a great job of sort of synthesizing and pulling together a lot of the themes of the book. So I'm going to be drawing from his comments on this, which is kind of bringing together a lot of comments that other people have had as well. But Mark and Jane represent kind of this pair of opposites. They're both scholars, they're both young, they're married together, but it's not a happy marriage. Mark is very much ambitious. He's secured a place, a fellowship at the local college, and has kind of worked his way into the inner circle of the progressive element there at the school. But he's always looking to kind of get further into the inner workings and inner circle. His great fear in life is being excluded from places of influence or positions of power, or being looked down on or dismissed by people who are successful. And so he's always worried about his standing and always looking to advance his standing and kind of leave behind the previous friends or circle that he had as he kind of goes more and more into that inner ring. If you've read C.S. Lewis's essay, The Inner Ring, Mark Studdick is that. He is, in a novel, the portrayal of that dynamic that Lewis talks about. And so he is working his way into the progressive element of the college, which he comes to learn is actually working towards bringing in this outside organization, the NICE is what it's called, that wants to establish a headquarters there at Edgestowe, the town where the university is. And so he ends up being pulled into that organization, and again, working his way through the different circles, becoming more and more influential and powerful, and learning more and more about what's going on. His wife, though, is being neglected by him. He's so focused on his own pursuits and efforts that they actually have very few scenes together. Mostly what we're doing is kind of jumping back and forth in the book between Mark's storyline and then Jane's storyline, and they end up kind of following opposite paths, although there's interesting parallels along the way. So Jane's great fear is not being excluded, which is Mark's, a great concern. Her great fear is being imposed upon. She wants to maintain her independence. She wants to maintain her own goals and her own dreams. She's very much what, Gavin Ortland makes this point. She's very much how Lewis described himself before he became a Christian, because he very much didn't want his freedom impinged upon. He didn't want to have to give up pleasures or liberties. He wanted to be his own man. And he saw God and Christianity, rightly in many ways, as something that would take ownership of his life, something that would make demands upon him. And so that's Jane's great fear. She wants to maintain her independence, whereas Mark always wants to be brought into the inner circle. And so the story, as it unfolds, is in essence both of them working through those challenges and coming to a point of conversion. Conversion to the side of good, and conversion to God himself. And Lewis does all sorts of interesting things with that. You end up having, again, both Mark and Jane entering into different circles, different organizations that have different figureheads who end up being kind of interesting pairs. Wither is the head of the group that Mark is drawn into, whereas Ransom, from the first two books, is the head of the organization that Jane ends up getting drawn into. And there's this contrast that's being drawn then between good and evil and the different ways that they present themselves. And it's just fascinating. I mean, I think this is one of those books that, in a sense, the characters are almost more Dickensian. They're kind of representative of types. They're kind of caricatures, not in the sense of being flat or uninteresting, but in the sense of being almost representative. And one of the things that's an absolute key to getting your mind around that hideous strength is that it is, as the subtitle says, it's a modern fairy tale for grown-ups. And Lewis talks in the preface about how, we're very used to, in a fairy tale, having supernatural elements and kind of crazy unexpected things happened, right? Pumpkins turn into carriages, and girls find dwarves living in the woods, and you think about your favorite fairy tale, and all these fantastic things are happening. And yet he says what we miss is that the fairy tales all begin in the kind of mundane, ordinary life. It's just not our life, so we don't see it as mundane. But when you see a servant girl living in a great house, or you see a princess in a castle, like that feels exotic to us because it's so foreign to our life. But that's just starting things in everyday life. And in the same way, in his modern day fairy tale, he's starting with the kind of, this unhappy marriage of these, entry level academics. I mean, this is not thrilling, gripping material, but more and more fantastic things start happening. And eventually what's going to happen, I won't go through all aspects of the plot, you can enjoy that yourself, but eventually what ends up happening is that we realize that the conflict that's going on between the organization that Mark's being drawn into and the organization that Jane is being drawn into is actually really part of this kind of cosmic conflict between the Eldil or the Oyarsa that Ransom had met when he visited Melicandra and Out of the Silent Planet, or Paralandra in the second novel. These good spiritual beings, kind of angelic beings, who are ruling in those other places, and yet Thulkandra, which is Lewis's name for Earth, has been under the domain of this dark or twisted Oyarsa, this fallen angel or Eldil, Satan, who has cut off Earth from the rest of the heavens. And because mankind has penetrated the heavens in the form of Weston and Divine in the first book, and then Weston again in the second book, those good forces now have free reign to come into Thulkandra and to deal with this evil threat that's rising up in this little town of Edgestowe. So you can already sort of hear in that, like, there's a really strange blending of like ordinary, everyday, mundane kinds of things and fantastic, cosmic, extraordinary things. And Lewis just blends those all together. And that's one of the things, Ortlund makes the point in his video, that's one of the things people struggle with, is that kind of blending of the natural and the supernatural. In fact, Ortlund quotes from a review that George Orwell wrote of that Hideous Strength when it first came out. And that was kind of one of the lines of critique that he had, as he said, Lewis is trying to kind of have it both ways. It would have worked if it was a natural story or if it was a supernatural story, but to blend these together is just too confusing. But I think that's missing something really important, which is, first off, Lewis has already told us how to read the book. It's a modern fairy tale, so it's going to start with ordinary elements, but you're going to meet fantastic things. And secondly, in Lewis's conception, a Christian conception, there isn't that neat and tidy divide between the natural and the supernatural, between the temporal and the eternal. Sorry, one of my daughters had to pop in and ask me a question. So, but in Lewis's conception, as a Christian, he doesn't have those kinds of divisions. And this book, and I think the whole series, is a reflection of that. It's interesting that Lewis takes up the challenge of writing a sci-fi trilogy that is really an exploration of spiritual themes. We tend to think of sci-fi as the realm of the materialist and the atheist, and yet Lewis says, okay, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to delve into the eternal and the spiritual. And one of the things that he's doing really throughout the trilogy, but in that Hideous Strength in particular, is vindicating the medieval world in contrast to the modern world. So again, without going into all the details of what happens, you have medieval figures like Merlin, who actually ends up becoming a big character in the book, and kind of comes back to life, as it were, or from his sleep to fight against the forces that are there. I won't go into too many details, but so there's this contrast that's being drawn between the modern mind, which wants to exert its power and control over nature, and this medieval mind that wants to submit itself to and delight in nature. And so Lewis is playing with those ideas, and he's turning on its head the kind of common mindset or assumption that the medieval world was a dark age, right? Where people were clouded in ignorance and superstition and just subject to all these forces. And he says, actually, it's a time of light and delight and all of these things. Of course, Lewis is a medievalist in terms of his training and his background and his love. And so he's kind of arguing for that over against the modern view that he says, it does it in different ways and with different kind of philosophies, but it is fundamentally something that is turned against nature, and therefore against man. And so he's in doing that contrast. This is one of the things that makes the book interesting. He's able then to critique a lot of the pathologies of our modern mind, and he does that through different characters. So you have in the NICE, the kind of evil institution that Mark is being drawn into before he's kind of converted and comes out of it, is you have different characters who are all kind of bigwigs in that group, but they all advocate different philosophies. You know, one is very much like social reformer. One is like basically like an unorthodox priest who wants to use the teachings of Scripture as kind of a mythical backdrop to advocate for his own revolutionary ideas. Others are kind of cold scientific materialists who are seeking to free humanity of limitations and achieve immortality through technical achievements, technology, and so forth. Others are kind of embedded in the bureaucracy. There's all these different kinds of faces that it takes, but Lewis makes the argument that behind those is the same impulse, the same thing. So this is one of the keys to understanding the book, and one of the things that can help you to kind of unlock and see into what Lewis is doing. Lewis is giving us in that Hideous Strength, in novel form, in about 400 pages, he's giving you in novel form a picture of what he's writing about in his perhaps more commonly read book, The Abolition of Man. That's a very short book, I think just about 100 or so pages, where he's doing the same thing. He's critiquing modernity, contrasting it with an older Christian way of thinking. And the characters in this book and the themes he's fleshing out are by and large the same. And I'm not just reading that into the book. That's one of the things that Lewis himself says in the preface. He says, "This is a tall story about devilry, though it has behind it a serious point, which I have tried to make in my Abolition of Man." So one entryway into this book, what I would recommend, is if you have not read The Abolition of Man, start there. Read that book, get a sense of the ideas and the points that Lewis is trying to make, and then pick this up as something that will kind of put flesh on that skeleton. Or if you have read The Abolition of Man, keep that in the back of your mind as you're reading this. I think, in a sense, you could read The Abolition of Man and then his essay, The Inner Ring, as a good preface to reading that Hideous Strength. And I think if you do that, you'll get a better sense of what's going on. But this is a book that, for all of its complexity and all of its kind of strangeness, and there are weird elements to it, it's unlike any other book I've read, and even any other book by C.S. Lewis that I've read, but there's a lot going on, and it is a beautiful book. There's a lot of structural sophistication in terms of how these parallel stories of Mark and Jane and these two organizations and all of that are kind of played out. And when you sort of step back from it and begin to assess it from a more literary perspective, you can't walk away and say, Lewis is just writing drivel. He's writing something that's very well thought through and very well fleshed out. It is demanding, it is challenging, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but I really enjoyed it. And I would encourage anyone who's a Lewis fan, anyone who wants to think about these ideas, to consider reading the whole Space Trilogy, including the last book, That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis.